"Stay sharp, boys, watch the treetops." The warning drifted quietly through the humid air, swallowed by the towering jungle. The year was 1942, and the Pacific had become a battleground. The scattered Solomon Islands, just northeast of Australia, were no longer quiet or forgotten. Japanese forces had dug themselves in, carving airstrips and bunkers into the tropical interior, confident they could hold this strategic chain against anyone who dared approach. What they didn't know was that the jungle held more than soldiers. As the United States prepared its campaign, the Navy focused first on Guadalcanal, a name that would soon be etched into the pages of military history. The Japanese worked tirelessly under the crushing heat, sweating over trenches, supply lines, and hidden defensive positions, completely unaware that they were not alone. Local Solomon Islanders had spoken quietly for generations about something living deep inside the rainforest, something ancient, something powerful. But even if they had tried to warn the invaders, the Japanese likely would have laughed it off as superstition. Then the fighting began, when U.S. Marines stormed the beaches, followed by Army units pushing deeper inland. Strange whispers spread through the ranks. At first, the reports sounded impossible. Men were vanishing from rear positions. Patrols went quiet without explanation. Bodies, or what was left of them, were found torn apart. The stories all described the same thing: a massive, unnatural figure feeding on the fallen. Some believed it was a predator that the jungle had kept hidden for centuries. Others said it was something far worse, something that was never meant to be seen. This would become one of the most chilling legends of the war, the tale of the Solomon Island giants. Before the fighting reached these shores, World War II felt distant to the islanders. Trouble belonged to Europe or the sprawling lands of Asia. But after the attack on Pearl Harbor, that illusion shattered. British officials evacuated colonists. Local workers were told to hide or return to their villages. The stage was set. The islands would not stay silent for long. In May of 1942, Japanese forces seized the major islands, pushing farther south than ever before. They built an airfield on Guadalcanal and established a network of bases, preparing to choke off the sea routes between Australia and the United States. If they succeeded, Australia could be left vulnerable, its lifelines cut. America responded with urgency. The first move, a counter-invasion of Guadalcanal. On August 7, 1942, the 1st Marine Division came ashore, stepping into thick jungle and unfamiliar terrain. The Japanese had met little resistance during their occupation. The islanders had no weapons, and peace had been their way of life. But the treatment they received from their new rulers was brutal. The Japanese imposed harsh control and forced thousands of Korean laborers into deadly conditions. Resentment spread quickly. The islanders quietly helped the Americans, offering information, guidance, and support whenever they could. Before the war had even begun, the Royal Australian Navy had created a hidden network of coast watchers, civilians positioned across remote islands to observe enemy activity and report movement. As the conflict grew, these observers would play an unexpected role in what came next. District officers, plantation owners, even missionaries, all knew about the hidden network of coast watchers scattered across the islands. Once the Japanese learned of these men, they did everything they could to track them down, but every attempt failed. The coast watchers were not fighters. Most had never seen a battlefield. Yet they had something far more valuable, an intimate knowledge of the terrain. They slipped through the jungle like shadows, familiar with every path, ridge, and hidden cove. The Japanese searched, but the watchers always vanished, blending into the trees and sending radio reports to Allied forces on troop movements and supply routes. It was one of these men, silent, unseen, who noticed the construction of a Japanese airfield on Guadalcanal and shared that information with the Australians. The message quickly reached U.S. command, shaping the decision that Guadalcanal would become the first major offensive target in the Pacific campaign. With the coast watchers and the Australian Navy feeding them intelligence, American forces struck hard. They overwhelmed the Japanese coastal defenses, gaining a foothold on the beaches. But taking the islands would prove far from easy. The campaign dragged on for 6 brutal months. Once the Japanese lost control of the shoreline, they retreated inland. Their strategy shifted to guerrilla warfare, hit-and-run raids, ambushes, and sudden disappearances back into the jungle. The terrain favored them, mountainous, dense, and unforgiving. Pursuing them became a slow, grinding effort for American Marines. Some islands were cleared within days, others fought back for months. And as U.S. pressure pushed the Japanese deeper into the heart of the islands, soldiers began whispering about something far worse than bullets or bayonets. Rumors spoke of encounters with enormous, human-like beings. The reports described towering figures, anywhere from 8 to 15 feet tall, with burning red eyes. Their bodies were covered in tangled hair, black, brown, even shades of deep red. At first, these stories sounded like the familiar legends told in other war zones, tales of strange ape-like creatures. But soon, it became clear this was different. These giants were said to look more human, and they were armed. Massive stone clubs, spears, primitive weapons that could crush armor and bone alike. Japanese soldiers who crossed their path rarely survived. Witness accounts told of men being ambushed in the darkness, struck down, dragged screaming into the underbrush, torn apart, or devoured on the spot. Other stories painted an even more terrifying picture. The giants didn't just attack, they defended territory. They roared through the forests, uprooting entire trees as if they were nothing more than tall grass. Soldiers fled at the sight of them, scattering into the shadows. Those who escaped hid flat against the jungle floor, praying to remain unseen as monstrous footsteps crashed nearby. All night they listened to heavy breathing, distant roars, and the sudden, horrifying silence that followed a comrade's final scream. Daylight brought no relief. The Japanese faced American forces on the front lines, but when night fell, the true terror returned. Sleep became impossible. Fear seeped into every moment. If these stories contained even a trace of truth, then at least a handful of Japanese soldiers must have survived long enough to speak of them, men later captured by American troops, trembling as they recounted what waited for them in the jungle. We can only imagine their fear whispers began circling among American troops, rumors of Japanese soldiers stumbling out of the jungle, wild-eyed and half-broken, telling stories no one could understand. To those who heard them, the men sounded delirious, as if trauma had shattered their grip on reality. But these soldiers weren't speaking about defeat or surrender. They spoke of giants. For a Japanese soldier in World War II, surrender was not just dishonorable, it was nearly unthinkable. Their code demanded only 3 outcomes: return home victorious, die while fighting, or if defeat became unavoidable, take their own lives with honor. The image of being torn apart by towering beasts was a fate their culture never imagined preparing them for. Some Japanese men were captured during the campaign, despite their warrior ethos. They came from a tradition shaped by samurai ideals, where surviving after losing was a disgrace. And if any of those captives truly emerged from the jungle claiming that man-eating giants hunted their units, then what happened to them afterward has been swallowed by time. 8 decades later, their accounts have faded into rumor, dismissed as myth by most people beyond the Solomon Islands. But on the islands themselves, the story is very different. Locals insist there is nothing mythical about these beings. They speak of giants not as fantasy, but as fact creatures that once roamed and perhaps still roam the hidden jungles today. To them, the soldiers' tales were not unbelievable, only confirmation. Although much of the Solomon Islands' history has been lost, buried by poverty, colonial disruption, and years without formal record-keeping, It is well understood that even by 1942, vast portions of the island interiors remained untouched. Thick with ancient forest and riddled with valleys and caves, the heart of the islands remained a land unknown even to those who lived closest to it. And even now, much of what resides in those jungles remains a mystery. This isolation was rooted in the island's past. A couple of centuries ago, the Solomon Islands were dominated by fiercely territorial tribal groups. Many were headhunters, and some practiced cannibalism. They lived in fortified villages high on ridges or even among the treetops, always guarding against rival tribes and the dangers of the wild. Everything changed when Christian missionaries arrived in the 1800s. The conversion of the tribes over the following decades gradually ended generations of conflict. With war no longer at their doorsteps, people moved their homes closer to the coastline, building calmer communities near the shoreline. The inland mountains and deep jungles, once full of hunters and warriors, fell silent. And through that silence, something else was given room to grow. For the next 200 years, the central wilderness became a place of absence. No settlements, no consistent human presence, only rumor. Whatever lived there remained hidden. The stories, however, never died. While European parents warned their children of wolves, the islanders warned theirs of something far worse, towering cannibals who lurked in the forest shadows. Ask an islander today why these stories persisted, and many will simply answer, because the giants are real. World War II didn't create the legends, it only exposed them to outsiders. In recent years, field archaeologist Nicholas Cox traveled deep into the islands in search of forgotten Japanese outposts, rusted weapons, and relics swallowed by jungle growth. His journey into the Solomon Islands began in 2019, driven by curiosity about what truly occurred in those dark interiors where only legends dare to linger. When archaeologist Nicholas "Nick" Cox first heard the stories, he didn't take them too seriously. The tales of wartime giants roaming the Solomon Islands felt like folklore, half memory, half myth, repeated so many times that no one could tell where truth began. But everything changed when a friend told him about his own experience in 1995. This friend had joined a forestry project deep in the islands, and while there, became the first outsider to lay eyes on a hidden network of Japanese tunnels dating back to World War II. The moment Nick learned this, his curiosity ignited. He immediately began planning an expedition of his own, hoping to see what was left behind in those jungles. While researching, he came across strange claims. Japanese soldiers encountering gigantic humanoids, towering figures stalking the heart of the islands during the war. The details varied, but the theme was always the same: massive men, impossible in size, relentless, terrifying. Interestingly, the stories weren't coming from Japan's historical record. Most of the surviving details circulated through foreign researchers, second-hand accounts, and cryptozoology forums, both English and Japanese. Some Japanese enthusiasts even referred to these beings as titans. Nick found this intriguing, yet frustrating. There were no first-person reports, no direct testimonies from Japanese soldiers themselves. The more he researched, the more he suspected the tales might be inventions, fabricated long after the war to feed the imaginations of monster hunters. But when he finally arrived in the Solomon Islands, everything changed. He expected villagers to laugh at the idea of giants, maybe dismiss them as stories for scaring children. Instead, they treated the subject with complete seriousness. To them, giants weren't folklore, they were simply real. Many islanders said the giants were still alive somewhere deep within the interior wilderness. Others believed the creatures had died off generations ago, either wiped out by time or destroyed by their own violent nature, possibly disappearing around the same period missionaries arrived. Although no local could personally verify the old Japanese encounters, none dismissed them. If Japanese soldiers vanished into the jungle, the locals said, the interior is exactly where giants would have found them. Almost no one ventures that far inland, not because of superstition, but because of fear. The villagers Nick spoke with were almost all devout Christians, yet they carried a heavy awareness of their past. Their ancestors were once headhunters, warriors, and in some cases, cannibals. Many locals expressed sorrow about this heritage, while also acknowledging a strange fascination with it. And here is where their stories grew even stranger. Some believe their tribal forebears learned cannibalism from the giants themselves. They say constant contact with man-eating giants influenced their early culture, leaving behind a dark legacy that lasted into more recent centuries. Nick learned that not every island is home to these beings, but one island in particular, Mal, was repeatedly mentioned. Locals insisted that Mal was rich in giant activity long ago. One man named Ishmael even claimed to carry giant blood in his veins. He said his lineage traced back to a renowned warrior, one of the last known giants, who lived during the colonial period, a time when headhunters still roamed. According to Ishmael, some giants lived openly in the jungles, while others resided in vast underground cave networks. Despite the immense ocean separating island from island, many locals believe deep passage systems connect them beneath the earth, a hidden world linking territories no human has ever fully mapped. Whether Ishmael's claims were truth or family legend, the idea itself wasn't unusual. Around the world, stories often speak of strange beings hiding far below the surface, creatures sealed away in endless cave systems, unseen for generations. Some people link such tales to the hollow earth theory, though others believe these caverns simply sheltered things that preferred darkness over daylight. On the Solomon Islands, many locals believe giants did not simply appear from nowhere. Instead, though their kind is separate from humans, their earliest bloodline is said to have originated from humanity long, long ago. The islands themselves take their name from scripture, named after King Solomon, and because most residents today are Christian, it isn't surprising that many interpret these giants as descendants of the Nephilim, the colossal race mentioned in the Old Testament. If their ancestry ties back to humans, the islanders claim, it would explain why these beings are still capable of breeding with people, and they say there are stories proving it. One such story is known across Guadalcanal and beyond. It centers around a woman named Mango, who died in the year 2000. Her disappearance began decades earlier, around 1950, only a few years after the war ended. One morning, she simply vanished. Search parties combed the jungle, the beaches, even nearby villages. After enough time passed, everyone assumed she was dead. 25 years later, she was found. She appeared suddenly on the northeast coast of Guadalcanal, wild-eyed, foaming at the mouth, clearly out of her senses. Her clothes were ragged, her body starved, and she was heavily pregnant. The men who discovered her struggled to restrain her, eventually carrying her to safety. Mango never fully recovered, though care from her family and neighbors brought her close enough to reality that she could speak about some of what had happened. She said she hadn't wandered off or run away. She'd been taken. According to her, a giant had stolen her from her village and kept her deep in the interior, claiming her as a wife. She said this giant had eventually forced her into pregnancy, the child she carried when she was found. The baby was born healthy, though unusual. Locals described him as mixed, half human, half something else. He survived until the age of 5. Then, for reasons no one will explain, one of Mango's brothers killed the child. To this day, some residents say they know where the small grave lies. Others quietly claim Mango was not the only woman taken by giants, just the one who returned. The story of Mango gained international attention when it was later included in the book Solomon Islands Mysteries, Accounts of Giants and UFOs in the Solomon Islands. Its author, Marius Boron, had moved to the islands in 1995 after serving as a helicopter engineer in the Royal Australian Air Force. While living there, he gathered countless accounts from the locals, tales they'd passed down from their grandparents and great-grandparents. In his writing, Marius mentions two more women from Guadalcanal who vanished and were believed to have been taken by giants. But the stories didn't stop there. The islanders told him their ancestors once fought brutal wars against these beings. The giants were said to storm villages, sometimes killing islanders for food, other times out of cruel amusement. Villages responded by sending warrior parties into the mountains to hunt them, yet many who went out never returned. Each attempt left fewer and fewer men. In time, Marius came to believe that, at least for a period, the giants of the Solomon Islands saw the humans living there not as neighbors or enemies, but as livestock. Some researchers believe the Solomon Islands should have a much larger population today, yet it remains surprisingly small. One controversial theory claims this is because, for thousands of years, giants allegedly hunted the islanders as a food source, leaving little opportunity for communities to grow. According to this idea, the giants eventually stopped preying on humans for three possible reasons: a massive conflict that occurred between the giant clans centuries ago, the arrival of firearms on the islands, and a strange and speculative third element, possible interference from unidentified beings. This theory came to wider attention through a book written by Marius Boron, a former Australian military aircraft engineer who moved to the Solomon Islands in the 1990s. His research blends military history with cryptid folklore, creating a story that is equal parts intriguing and unsettling. During a 2021 interview on the Into the Portal podcast, archaeologist Nicholas Cox commented on Boron's findings. He noted that while stories of giants and wartime mysteries are compelling, they often blur the line between historical possibility and pure speculation. Critics argue that Marius frequently veers into conspiracy territory, referencing secret world governments, UFO cover-ups, and alleged underground alien bases beneath the islands. Still, sightings of strange aerial lights aren't unheard of in the region. One account describes American naval forces during the Guadalcanal campaign witnessing dozens of glowing orbs flying in a diamond-shaped formation. Believing they were facing a new Japanese weapon, sailors scrambled to respond, but the lights vanished without ever making contact, and the incident faded into wartime chaos. Yet one of the most striking stories linked to Boron involves the Gold Ridge mine on Guadalcanal. Mining operations there have stopped and restarted many times over the past 30 years. But in the mid-1990s, shortly after receiving government approval, workers began clearing the jungle around the site. During excavation, a bulldozer malfunctioned when its enormous metal blade, so heavy it took several men just to detach it, was disabled by a broken pin. With no equipment strong enough to lift it from the mud, the crew removed the remaining pins and prepared to repair it the following morning. When they returned, the blade was gone. What they found instead were massive barefoot tracks, 3 to 4 feet long, pressed deep into the mud. Following the trail, workers discovered the blade roughly 100 meters away on a hillside. The impressions suggested that something with enormous strength either carried or hurled the blade from its original location. This unsettling discovery echoed stories told by Japanese soldiers decades earlier, accounts claiming that something huge was roaming the island's interior. Whether myth, misunderstanding, or a sign of something unexplained, these accounts continue to fuel curiosity about what may still be hidden within the untouched jungles of the Solomon Islands. While local mine workers always left the jungle before nightfall, the Japanese soldiers were not so fortunate. Forced to remain in the deep, vine-covered interior for months, they may have crossed into the territory of something far older. If the stories are to be believed, the giants did not appreciate the intrusion, the gunfire, the noise, or the strange new presence invading their hunting grounds. Their response, according to rumor, was violent. Trying to understand whether these tales held any truth, researcher Nicholas Cox learned that Solomon Islanders speak of other mysterious beings roaming the forests. One of the most frequently mentioned creatures is called the kakamura, a small, hairy humanoid similar to the North American Bigfoot, or more closely, Australia's yowie. Many islanders insist these beings inhabit the green labyrinth of the interior. Descriptions are chilling. Witnesses say the kakamura are foul-smelling, covered in thick hair, and armed with sharp claws. Even more frightening, they are believed to eat humans. They reportedly slip into villages around dusk, stealing fruit from gardens, and on rare occasions, children. These beings are said to prefer isolation, living high in trees or deep inside cave networks. They are not thought to make fire themselves, yet islanders claim they sometimes steal embers from humans and use them to build crude fires of their own. Locals also describe their strange communication, an eerie, cackling language, and say groups have been heard singing haunting melodies, echoing through the night jungle like a twisted chorus. While researching these stories, Cox read historical writings from German anthropologists working in the islands during the early 1900s. Shockingly, these accounts spoke of the kakamura in a surprisingly normal tone, describing their habits, diet, and daily life as though they were just another animal species. The matter-of-fact tone suggested these creatures were not treated as myth, but as something familiar. Cox also reasoned that it would be nearly impossible for two similar species, giants and kakamura, to coexist in the same small region without one eventually wiping out the other. He suspected that the smaller beings, usually described as around 4 to 5 feet tall, might be the true source of the giant stories. Either the kakamura were being exaggerated, or perhaps these tales described young forms of a larger species. But Cox doubted that a 4-foot creature could grow into a 15-foot titan. Like many legends, he believed the stories may have grown taller over time, especially after frightening encounters. Men who fled into the darkness would naturally exaggerate what they saw, convincing themselves that the creatures were enormous to justify the terror they felt. He further argued that if true 15-foot giants existed, they would require massive amounts of food and space. On small islands, such a creature would frequently cross paths with human settlements. Their existence would be much more visible, documented, and undeniable. In his view, the legends of giants likely trace their roots back to encounters with unusually large kakamura, small, secretive, and frightening enough on their own. Even if these creatures stood only 6 or 7 feet tall, their size alone would have been intimidating. Most Solomon Island men average around 5'4", so even a moderately larger creature, especially one covered in hair or bearing strange features, would have appeared frightening under the jungle canopy. When it comes to the rumored giants and their interference with the Japanese occupation of Guadalcanal, one puzzle stands out: the strange silence the U.S. Marines encountered when they made landfall. According to author Marius Boron, the Japanese had plenty of time to prepare for an American counterattack. Yet when U.S. forces stormed Red Beach on August 7, 1942, they found no resistance waiting for them. They lost not a single man during the landing. Moving inland, the Marines quickly seized a partially built airstrip at Lunga Point, later renamed Henderson Airfield. The ease of this advance was bizarre. The Japanese were known for fierce, unrelenting resistance in nearly every island campaign that followed, yet here they seemed to have vanished. Why? Historians generally agree the Japanese never believed the Allies would strike Guadalcanal so early. Their victories throughout Asia had bred overconfidence, and they likely underestimated the strategic urgency of the island. Meanwhile, the U.S. expected to face thousands of defenders. Those additional Japanese soldiers arrived only later, shipped in as reinforcements after the fighting had already begun. Boron, however, had another interpretation. He claimed that beyond what was officially recorded, some Japanese troops were taken by enormous humanoid beings, creatures that treated them as prey. Boron wrote that a portion of the invading force also crossed paths with what he described as half-human, lizard-like warriors. According to his account, word of these encounters made its way back to command, leading the Japanese to simply abandon the island's interior to these beings, explaining why the Allies found so few soldiers during their opening assault. In Boron's words, the island was essentially surrendered to the creatures. If that were true, that these beings were already attacking long before U.S. forces pushed the Japanese inland, it raises an obvious question. Why did the Japanese Navy continue sending wave after wave of reinforcements to a place supposedly haunted by flesh-eating giants and reptilian warriors? This is one of the many details skeptics point to when dismissing Boron's theories. Still, the claims do not end there. Boron believed that deep beneath the islands lies a vast network of cave systems, places where these beings still live out of sight. Convinced that these caverns hide far more than wildlife, he speculated that the same underground spaces may also conceal UFO installations. The story grows stranger when paired with wartime accounts from American troops who claim to see formations of glowing objects flying over the sea, silent, bright orbs moving in tight patterns before vanishing into the dark. These sightings weren't only reported on Guadalcanal. Similar descriptions arose decades later from U.S. soldiers stationed in Vietnam, where men claim to have seen bizarre, predatory creatures roaming enemy-controlled regions. As Boron continued piecing together legends, oral histories, and rumors, he visited a Japanese war memorial on Guadalcanal. What he found there would further reinforce his belief that something ancient and hidden still occupies the deep interior of these islands. The main feature of the Japanese war memorial is a large geometric concrete sculpture, but one corner of the original garden once displayed a bronze statue of a man. Marius claimed the figure appeared to be a half-human creature with scales, holding a ray gun-like object attached to the end of its tail. However, others strongly disagree with this interpretation. According to researchers, the statue simply depicted a fisherman holding a net and gazing out to sea. It had been crafted before World War II by a Japanese sculptor who was later drafted into the Imperial Army and killed on Guadalcanal. After his death, the sculptor's father donated the statue to the Mount Austin Memorial. Why Marius insisted on describing it as a reptilian humanoid remains unclear, though it clearly aligns with his broader theories. His interpretation appears to stretch beyond reasonable evidence, seemingly attempting to connect the statue to legends of underground lizard men. To its credit, the statue does have an odd history. Sometime between 1999 and 2003, militants shot bullet holes through it. Then, in 2008, thieves sawed the statue from its base to sell as scrap. It proved too heavy to carry and was abandoned nearby. Authorities eventually moved it into storage, where it reportedly remains, likely to prevent further theft. Returning to the larger narrative, one question remains. If the Japanese truly feared the island, why did they send thousands of reinforcements to Guadalcanal? The more realistic explanation is that the Japanese initially stationed only a few hundred troops there, believing the Allies would not target the island. Overconfident after a string of victories, they underestimated its strategic value. Regardless, the Solomon Islands have become surrounded by an unusual tangle of legends. UFO sightings, tales of the Kakamura, violent island history, and stories of Japanese soldiers encountering reptilian humanoids and giants. Together, they form a tapestry of mystery that has yet to be fully understood. The more these stories unfold, the more the Solomon Islands resemble something from King Kong, a hidden world teeming with ancient secrets. Fittingly, the nation's emblem includes the phrase, "the land that time forgot," a title often used for stories about prehistoric creatures surviving in isolation. Still, if tales of giants are only folklore, where did they originate? One possible clue comes from a 1977 article published in Pacific Islands Monthly titled, "Kakamura Goes Home." The article honors a well-respected doctor who spent most of his life serving the Melanesian people on the island of Makira. He first arrived there in 1903 as a missionary schoolteacher. According to the article, Makira was once infamous for its cannibalism. During his stay, Dr. Fox was adopted by the Orosi tribe and exchanged names with a young chief, taking on the nickname Kakamura. This suggests the chief's name, like the stories, was tied to the mysterious, hairy beings rumored to inhabit the island. In 1933, Dr. Fox moved to the island of Mal, described as greatly feared because of the hostility of its people. Even then, Mal's inhabitants were regarded as dangerous. The same island is still said to be inhabited by giants, and one man named Ishmael insisted that his bloodline could be traced back to a warrior giant from the island of Mal. This may sound impossible, but the story becomes even stranger. The same region was once home to Dr. Charles Fox, a missionary and later a coast watcher during World War II. According to historical accounts, Fox secretly passed intelligence to the Allied forces, helping them drive out Japanese soldiers. One testimony claimed, the Japanese tried again and again to capture him, but Fox always slipped away, warned by locals who guided him into the interior jungles. The Japanese refused to follow him, terrified of the hostile tribes who lived deeper in the island. This suggests a very different picture of Mal's people during the war. They weren't peaceful villagers living quietly by the shore. They were still tribal, powerful, and dangerous, and the Japanese soldiers knew it. So perhaps the frightening wartime stories of giants hunting Japanese troops were exaggerations of encounters with these fierce tribes. Or considering the long-standing tales of hairy forest beings, maybe the truth was a blend of both legend and reality. The name Kakamura appears again in a 2008 publication, Images of the Wild Man in Southeast Asia, written by anthropologist Professor Gregory, Forth of the University of Alberta. His research explores reports of wild, human-like creatures found in Southeast Asia, including those described in the Solomon Islands for generations. His findings matched much of what Nicholas Cox discovered about the region. The stories weren't recent inventions. They were deeply rooted, especially on the island of Mal, where Dr. Fox had lived and studied. Fox was even given the nickname Kakamura, sharing a name with a local chief. His experiences pushed him to study the mysterious beings said to inhabit the forests. In his work and in Professor Forth's interviews with villagers, the creatures were described consistently. Covered in thick hair, long, sharp nails known for stealing food, and even fire sometimes heard speaking in an eerie, unintelligible language, said to hunt with simple weapons like nets and spears, and most disturbing, rumored to eat human flesh. These reports came from different islands, communities, and generations, yet the descriptions stayed remarkably similar. Professor Forth's research also noted something unusual. Dr. Fox may have been the first to observe that sightings of the Kakamura declined sharply after firearms were introduced around 1860. But once colonial authorities confiscated those weapons decades later, sightings suddenly returned within just a few months. Fox documented these stories in 1924 in his book The Threshold of the Pacific. He admitted that the number of consistent, independent testimonies made him consider that these creatures might truly exist in the deep interior. Around that time, local islanders believed the colonial government would pay £20 for a captured Kakamura. Some even attempted to trap one. Fox also proposed a striking alternative theory. Perhaps the Kakamura weren't just a strange species, but rather survivors of an ancient population that once lived in or near the Solomons. Maybe they predated the modern islanders entirely. Nicholas Cox pointed out an important detail. It doesn't seem plausible that these smaller, ape-like beings, reportedly just 4 to 5 feet tall, were the same giants said to stand 8, 12, or even 15 feet. Sightings of the smaller beings were relatively frequent, while stories of true giants were rare. So again, we're left with a mystery, 2 different creatures, 1 species misunderstood, or stories that grew larger every time they were told. Whatever the truth, the Solomon Islands hold more questions than answers. Some believe that these kakamura, despite their smaller size, and the frightening tribes that once lived deep within Mal, might be the true spark behind the stories of giants encountered by Japanese soldiers. Yet the idea of giants is hardly new. Tales of massive beings living alongside humans stretch back thousands of years. The ancient Israelites even wrote about meeting towering warriors in the desert lands of Egypt and Israel, claiming they felt as small as insects compared to them. And strangely, stories of similar creatures aren't limited to ancient texts. One of the most unsettling modern claims comes from U.S. military personnel stationed in Afghanistan in 2002. They described facing a massive, cave-dwelling warrior who wielded an enormous spear, an encounter that supposedly ended in bloodshed. If these stories are connected, it suggests the possibility that giant beings once moved across the globe the same way human tribes did. Archaeologists believe the first people entered the Americas roughly 30,000 years ago by crossing a land bridge from Asia, while enormous animals still roamed the earth. But some theories and a surprising number of old newspaper reports hint that humans might not have been the only ones to make the journey. Native cultures across Central and North America tell chilling tales of man-eating giants. One of the earliest documented encounters occurred in 1833 at Lompoc Rancho, California. Mexican soldiers digging out a pit for a powder magazine unearthed a massive human skeleton, nearly 13 feet long. Beside it rested a giant stone axe and carved shells marked with symbols no one could decipher. According to later articles, this discovery was only one of many similar finds scattered across the continent. It makes you wonder if there may be truth buried beneath all these legends. The stories of cannibalistic giants in the Solomon Islands, the rumors whispered by terrified Japanese troops, and the Native American accounts of ancient wars waged against creatures of unbelievable size. But that thread leads into another story entirely, one we'll save for a future night. Before we end this section, there's something worth sharing. The researcher who uncovered this tale originally set out to investigate a different topic, an old report about the Mexican military uncovering a giant skeleton. But as he followed the trail, more and more accounts surfaced. Giant bones, tribal battles, stories scattered across North and Central America. And then, buried in that mountain of research, he stumbled upon the strange events in the Solomon Islands. Stories he had never heard before. They pulled him off his original path and into this mystery, one that grew stranger the deeper he went. Like many stories of the unexplained, it didn't end neatly. It simply opened another door. This story is one that I approached with a healthy amount of skepticism. Yet, after digging into it, I'm still left scratching my head. The Solomon Islands hold mysteries that even the locals openly acknowledge, and the deeper you look, the harder it becomes to dismiss them. I always try to rely on research, documented evidence, and whatever facts I can gather to make sense of these accounts from a logical point of view. But every time I reach the end, I find myself staring at the same unanswered question. What if the evidence actually supports what people have been claiming, no matter how unbelievable it sounds? What makes this even stranger is a pattern that keeps repeating across the world. Wherever there are reports of cryptid encounters, you also find stories of UFOs, strange lights, or contact with entities that don't fit any conventional explanation. I'm not sure what to make of it. There are plenty of theories, interdimensional beings, extraterrestrials, and other ideas that sound like science fiction, but they persist for a reason. Maybe one day we'll finally understand what's behind all of this. Until then, I love hearing your thoughts. Tell me what you think in the comments. And if you want to reach out directly, you can use the contact form on wartimestories.com. There's also a page where you can submit episode suggestions. So if you have a story you'd like to see covered in the future, that's the place to share it. If you've emailed me already and haven't heard back yet, I apologize. Between researching, writing, and producing each episode, things get busy. Story submissions take time to read and respond to, and I'm still working through a backlog. I appreciate your patience, especially while I'm training new people, which has taken me away from some of the administrative work, but I will get to your message. If you'd like to support the channel, there's merchandise available on the site as well, shirts, challenge coins, things like that. For those of you who have already purchased something, thank you. It genuinely helps me keep this channel moving forward and growing into what you all want it to become. To everyone helping behind the scenes, and especially to my patrons whose names you see in the credits, your support means a lot. Month after month, you've had my back, and I can't thank you enough. If I owe you a message on Patreon, I'll be getting back to those soon, too. So, as always, thank you for watching and thank you for subscribing. May God be with all of you, wherever you are and whatever you're facing. I'll see you in the next episode.